Morning, everybody, and thanks for coming. We have a packed house here. I'm Dr. Gordon Chung from Epic Capital. I'm a neuroradiologist by training. Got into angel investing over 10 years ago, and eventually developed one of the largest angel networks in Canada. And then this, by natural progression, transformed into a healthcare fund with Epic Capital. And we do earlier stage Medtech type of companies. So I want to get an introduction from everybody else on this panel for you guys. Brief introduction. Charles, you want to start?
Sure. So I'm Charles Bridges. I'm actually a cardiothoracic surgeon by training. Also MD, PhD, degree in engineering. Joined J&J a year ago, and I'm essentially worldwide vice president of medical devices, focused on cardiovascular, with a primary interest in external innovation. I also work with our internal groups on a number of projects in the cardiovascular area.
David?
Hi, I'm David Heisinger. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Valuations, which is an early stage medical device developer and investor. I came to that by way of, actually, I was a molecularologist for a number of years, and eventually translated into working at a law firm. I was a patent attorney for a period of time, but eventually I managed what that firm referred to as its venture group, and then sort of just continued to branch into investments away from the firm and into my own company. I'm also on the board of advisors for a large healthcare fund, RESI, out of Houston, Texas.
Hi, good morning. I'm Garheng Kong. I run a fund called HealthQuest Capital. I was, I guess, similar to Charles, a professional student, so physician, scientist, business engineer by training, and then our fund is focused principally in healthcare, but outside of drug development. So devices, diagnostics, healthcare IT, technical healthcare services, consumer medicine. We're not that old, we've only been around 3 years, and we invest a few $100 million into these sort of categories, and so we're young and growing, but making new investments.
I'm Lisa Boreanaz. I'm Lisa Boreanaz. I'm a senior policy analyst with OCHIS, the Office of the Chief Health Innovation Strategist in Ontario. Prior to that, I was an industrial technology advisor at the federal funding program, National Research Council's Industrial Research Assistance Program. Like a lot of funding programs in Canada, the people who deliver the funds come to the job with a background in technology and business, so hopefully I'll be giving a perspective of the government as an investor.
Great. I just want to start off asking the panel, in Medtech, what do you think are the trends? What type of companies are you guys looking for? And also, in your particular domain, what do you see as a trend?
So, at HealthQuest, we tend to invest and partner with companies that are somewhere getting ready to ramp. And so when we think about medtech and devices and opportunities, we actually, when we all love science, most of our team are MDs or PhDs or MD PhDs, plus or minus MBA, but we really are focused on where the rubber meets the road. And so thematically, we invest on what we call value optimization, right? So it's a function of better patient outcomes and better health economics. So sometimes that's a really great outcome for patients and it costs a little bit more money, that's still good value. And sometimes it's the exact same outcome for the patient, but it's 5 less steps for somebody, and so it's really good for the health system. And so, I joke about this in our shop. I mean, we're happy to invest in the next Nobel Prize, but the truth is we're also happy to invest in the, what I call paper clip of healthcare, right? It got used 10 billion times last year. If you make it a little bit better, it's actually a lot of value to the healthcare system. And so, we look at everything through that lens, whether it be, a very high-end implantable device or you cause somebody to wash their hands more often, and so you have fewer hospital-acquired infections. So we're pretty open-minded about those themes, and that's a very general statement. Somebody asked me, well, what are some specific trends that you might be interested in? And I'll share a couple. One is what we call moving medicine away from the hospital. Right, so the hospital is the most expensive place to do anything per square foot, per unit time. So if you can do the same thing in the doctor's office or in the home, that's actually a really interesting process for us because it's better for the patient, it's better for the healthcare system. So that's certainly one thing that we spent a lot of time thinking about. And the other is what we call reducing complexity. Right, whether you're a physician or a nurse or a healthcare provider or a patient, medicine is very complex. People are spending too much time doing things, there's all these extra steps, and so if there's some innovation where you can take steps out of the healthcare system, what we found is, one, people make fewer mistakes, and then two, even if there's something great, it takes 500 steps for the physician to do it, it doesn't actually get adopted. So a couple of things that we're thinking of.
I would say, in addition to innovation and technology, like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, machine learning, I'm seeing a lot of innovative business models. So procurement is a barrier in Ontario, and the government is doing this, specifically the provincial government is doing some interesting things to reduce that burden. But what I'm seeing with successful companies, especially in the digital health space where traditionally the success has been defined as similar to SaaS metrics, like user acquisition, that doesn't really translate to revenue generally. So where I see a lot of interesting things happening is around revenue models. So pulling out of these high burden, challenging markets like maybe acute care or primary care, and developing revenue models in community care, for example. I'm seeing some really interesting things where instead of capital acquisition, we're seeing things around even SaaS or rental fees or consignment. So on the business side, the companies that are getting early traction, so really small companies getting early revenue, are the ones that have these innovative business models.
Yeah, I would say for us, most of what we initially get really excited about are things that we would call patient-centered opportunities. Two of the verticals that we are pretty heavily in are mobility and rehabilitation, and what we would call patient experience in the hospital. On the mobility and rehabilitation side, it's a huge issue in the United States, for example. So we have a product which is sort of exemplary of this. Our focus on this, which is a product to help stroke patients relearn how to walk. So in the United States, there are roughly 200,000 stroke patients who have been able to relearn how to walk somewhat or would be amenable to this technology, and it's a huge issue and those sorts of things. But those patients in the United States have a tremendous rehabilitation network and a variety of resources to them. Around the world, if you take that exact same set of sort of demographic for those stroke patients, there's over 12 million of them, mostly in developing countries where there is zero infrastructure for that rehabilitation. And the cost to those countries for those patients it's astronomical because they're unable, because they can't walk or mobilize, they're unable to sort of get back into the economic strain in many cases. And so any technology from our perspective that takes that, as Garhan was saying, takes the sort of therapy for them or helps them relearn how to walk and brings it to their home, or brings it to a more personal experience rather than having to be in a hospital or in a infrastructured system, not only has value here, but it has even more value around the world. And so patient-centered, I think, is a huge area of focus for us. Same thing exists in hospitals, right? So patient experience, I'm sure many of you are aware of this, right? But hospitals are directly compensated, at least in the United States, directly compensated based on how well the experience went for the patients. And, you know, that number, it's not talked about very much, and how hospitals deal with it is still a bit of a black box. But technologies that can sort of significantly alter that experience for those patients are, we feel, very, very hot area right now.
I can give you a little perspective from J&J's point of view. As you know, J&J is quite broad. We're quite broad in our interests. We're the largest healthcare company in the world, and so we've got both, even within medical devices, we've got orthopedics, #1 orthopedics company in the world, global surgery, #1 global surgery company in the world, focusing on endocutters, ablation, energy, with specific interest in cancer, specifically gastrointestinal, liver, and lung cancer. Lung cancer is actually a big focus both of our pharmaceutical division as well as our medical device division. We also are broadly interested in cardiovascular. We're the #1 company in atrial fibrillation in the world, but we're not actually in many other areas in cardiovascular devices currently, but we're very interested in expanding our footprint in cardiovascular, and specifically heart failure, structural heart, and atrial fibrillation, of course, which is already a core area for us. In addition, we have a consumer division. So when we talk about medical devices, we're not only talking about therapeutic devices, we're also talking about professional devices that require a physician or a professional of that nature. We're also talking about consumer devices and things like beauty, light therapy, smoking cessation. Those are all things that are of interest to us. And in addition, we're increasingly interested in digital health and all the ramifications of that. How do you use large data? As many of you probably know, we are in a joint venture with Google Life Sciences, Verily, in robotics. We've just also recently acquired a microwave ablation company, New Wave Medical. So again, our interests are quite broad, and in agreement with Garhung about how we think about the medical device landscape, we're interested in value creation. So the days when you could get physicians to buy into a new device just because it was sexy or the newest thing, those days are largely over. And now you have to be able to either improve better outcomes or similar outcomes and lower costs. And which requires evidence. So there's an increasing focus on evidence generation as well with devices. And so people who, and a lot of times the tendency in the market with early stage devices is, to get it out as fast as possible, which of course is important. But if it's not coupled with the appropriate evidence to show that it has value compared to the standard of care, then we don't think that those devices have a long-term likelihood of success. So we think it's very important to couple interventions and technology advancements with the appropriate evidence, which frankly hasn't always been the model for medical device development in the past, but we think increasingly will be important in the future. So
that's great. So reducing medical errors, patient experience is big. Epic likes those verticals. We also like the minimally invasive space. Just a question for Charles. You didn't mention anything about beating heart surgery. Where do you think that's going with minimally invasive cardiac surgery?
Sure. I didn't mention beating heart surgery because it's not a strategic area of focus for us. Again, our foci, I guess is the right word, in cardiovascular are structural heart, so heart valves, obviously transcatheter heart valves, transcatheter mitral valve repair, transcatheter mitral valves are things we're interested in but not in right now. But we follow those spaces extremely carefully and closely. And atrial fibrillation I mentioned, and heart failure. And one of the reasons for the focus on heart failure is because of the evolution in healthcare reimbursement. The fact that, as David alluded to, patient satisfaction is going to be an important metric. In addition, readmission is an important metric, in the so-called pay for performance, which is already impacting hospitals. Bundled care is already impacting hospitals, and cardiovascular has a disproportionate amount of influence in those new healthcare reimbursement paradigms, with heart failure, for example, being the #1 cause of readmission for patients over age 65. And 30% of patients who are admitted for heart failure, 25% actually, are readmitted within 30 days, 50% within 6 months. So, and if those readmissions are not reimbursed. So if you have a heart failure patient admitted to your hospital and they come back and on day 29, that admission is on you as the healthcare provider. And most healthcare systems, again, with this being a $40 billion cost to the healthcare system, cannot afford that. Therefore, there's increasing emphasis on what can we do to decrease readmissions around heart failure. So that's really been our focus,
Okay.
as opposed to beating heart or minimally invasive. But with robotics, of course, is again an important platform for us. And robotics is clearly an enabler for minimally invasive surgery. So we're really approaching it more from that angle.
Okay. How do you guys choose a company to invest in? And give you a couple ideas here. Do you pick the science over the team, or do you pick the team over the science? In addition to them being commercially viable.
Well, I'll just jump way out on a limb, and I'll just say it depends. and I actually mean that in all honesty, right? For us, a lot of it has to do with how we perceive the risks. If the if the risks appear to be execution or something along those lines, then management becomes most important. If the risks are associated with competition, then oftentimes intellectual property can be seen as sort of a key driver in where they sit. If the risks are perceived, or we perceive the risk to be a particular hurdle scientifically that has to be overcome before it's real, then clearly the scientists are the drivers, and can they execute. So, and that's for us mostly because we're at such an early stage, right? We come in oftentimes when things are almost at an idea stage, before there's even intellectual property formed. And so we're sort of, you can't hit all of those risks. We have to sort of make a jump or decide which one is going to drive it. So it changes a lot. Be good on all of them.
Yeah.
be great on all of them.
Yeah, I was going to hedge by saying both.
Right.
Because you can't have a great management team with no science. And if you have great science and no management team, that's also not going anywhere. So it's both. I would say we tend to do, and that's frankly where I come in our medical science and technology group, which is a new group at J&J, just less than 2 years old, is we focus on science first. And if the science doesn't make sense, then we're done. On the other hand, if it does make sense, then of course you have to have the management team, you have to have the commercial model, etc. So it really is all of the above. I'd be interested in Garhang's perspective because, as he alluded to, he's maybe the only panel member with more academic degrees than I have. So, and I know you're a scientist at heart. So, what's your thought about that?
Yeah, you're kind. My parents were wondering when I was going to get a job. So I would say that the comments around risk that David made are probably the metric that we spend the most time thinking about, right? Because at the end of the day, it's imperfect information, right? It's what's your view on the management team, what's your view on the science, what's your view on the competition or the market size, and the truth is, it's imperfect information, and so we're applying judgment across a lot of data points where you don't know the answer. And so there are a few things that are binary in nature. You know, Charles touched on this, which is if you don't have the science or the underlying technology right, that's actually much more difficult. So the way we think about it is we can help the business model, we can help the management team. We can't actually change Mother Nature. And so that part's the one part where no matter how experienced we feel like we may be as investors or a network, it's very hard for us to actually impose that change to the company. In fact, I mean, fair as investors, we should be good at a lot of things, but that's not one that, even though many people are agreed, they're not going to really go in and change your molecule or change your whatnot for you. J&J actually probably has the resources to help you do that. So from our point of view, when we look at it, we think of it as risk that we're taking and the risk that we can actually mitigate ourselves. And so along those dimensions, some we can actually affect and others we can't. And so we add that all up, of course, and then try and apply some judgment to the risk-return profile. But I do think as companies, you should expect your investment partner to help you. You just have to be realistic about what they can and can't do. I mean, if they can't help you raise money, they should be out of business, right? They for sure should be better at raising money than you are if you're running a company, because they do that all the time. But they probably, aren't better at, improving your device than you are or whatnot. So that's the way we look at it.
Yeah.
No, I just was curious if you could talk when it comes to IP. Are there investments that you guys make solely for IP purposes, or does it have to be those three that Triad talked about?
I guess I can speak up. I would say no, rarely. I mean, J&J, we've got thousands and thousands of patents that may or may not have value, and many that do have lots of value. That's probably one of the things we look at. I won't say last, it's definitely part of the equation, but we have very little interest in general in, we've got this really great patent, but we've got no prototype, we've got no management team, we have no commercial model, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's basically too early in general for J&J to want to get interested in. We typically want to see more sort of sweat equity around the idea beyond the patent filing. So that's usually not enough. It's necessary, but far from sufficient in most cases. But obviously, any company we look at, there's always the IP assessment that is an important component, and you can die 1,000 different deaths along the pathway, and that is certainly one of the things that can kill an opportunity for us if there's, if we don't think the IP is strong, or if we think there's not going to be freedom to operate, etc. But IP itself alone is rarely something that gets J&J excited, I would say.
We might be sort of on the opposite end of that spectrum because we're often the group that is funding the prototype development or funding the proof of concept experiment. And so a lot of times what we see are really ideas sort of caged as IP. I will say though that I can't think of a situation where we would ever just sort of where we would invest in intellectual property that was not actually coupled to a market. So we actually, I'm not exactly sure where your question was coming from, but we only would ever invest in markets that we think are, or opportunities that can exploit markets, right, that we think are good. And if the IP is the only asset around to how to begin getting a foothold into that, sometimes we do that. But we don't ever invest in IP just sort of for a long play to see what will develop around it.
I mean, the one other, I agree with what Charles did, is that the one other example, maybe to put a finer point on it, is we've been approached by companies to say, there's this huge market, there's this huge device, but we actually own the patent. And so if you invest in us, we'll actually win this lawsuit. And that's the investment thesis, and we'll never do that deal, right? So that's like a pure IP play. Now, there's actually other people who might do that, but we have not tended to bet principally on intellectual property.
The only thing I would add is with the rise of digital health and connected health, it's really hard to patent software, right? So an IP strategy alone is not enough to exclude your competition, right? So what else are you doing to exclude competition? So when we assess the opportunity of whether or not we're going to invest, whether or not there's IP around that is just a small portion. I think the strength of the technology, the accessibility of the market, the team, not just do the resources exist, but are they coachable? Because the government tends to come in quite early as an investor, very, very early. And we recognize that the team's not going to be there, but are they coachable? Because we're not going to embed ourselves as an executive, obviously.
For the entrepreneurs here, can each of you give 1 or 2 points as to how they can secure a meeting with you guys? What should they do? They should have a better slide deck.
Can I start with this one?
Go ahead.
So because a lot of government investors, the investment is non-dilutive, non-repayable, everybody wants to talk to you, right? So who doesn't want to talk to the people with the money? So for me, the biggest challenge that I have with really early companies is that they treat an investor pitch like a sales pitch. And it's not, it's a credibility pitch. So you need to pitch to me that you, your team, your technology, and the market is all credible. And there are a lot of things that early stage companies do that harms their credibility. And I think a lot of it is not being specific enough about the science. I think there's, we're developing an algorithm that's going to save the world. That's not specific enough for me to know what you're doing. The market, what drives me nuts is when people define their market as, Frost & Sullivan said it's $2 billion, I'm going to get 1% of that. So it's not about the size of the market, but it's about your credibility comes from how you define the market. So how did you drill down to define what your market opportunity is? And then the team. Too often I see scientific founders as CEOs who don't want to give up that title. So when companies come to me and they pitch their venture, it's all about credibility, and it's all about pulling those pieces together to tell a specific story for me to decide whether or not I'm going to invest more time. Not even money yet, just time.
Yeah, I mean, that is how to actually, get somebody to respond to you is a really tough question, and to me, it's changing all the time, because for our properties or our assets, we're reaching back out to people as well, so I'm on both sides of that equation. What I would say is, obviously for us, warm introductions are the best, so if there's somebody that can sort of vouch, or somebody that I know, a surrogate to that is LinkedIn. I get pegged by quite a few people who find me 1 degree of freedom away, or whatever the language is for a LinkedIn contact. And I tend to look at those more than I do others. But I would also say, and this is, I'm not sure, I'm surprised I'm admitting this in an open forum, but the Ray line is actually really, really important, because there's so many emails or things that can pop into those boxes that it's even hard for the people I'm supposed to be interacting with for me to keep track of, right? As I'm sure it is for everybody else. So good Ray lines that actually catch my attention, I tend to open.
Do you mean the subject line?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you guys think of the difference between Canada and the USA? We're finding valuations in Canada much lower than the companies we see from the US for similar stage, similar type of IP. What are you guys finding? And we notice some of the American companies are actually now starting to come to Canada to look for companies. Any comments?
Yeah, so I happen to be based in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is one area that is certainly fully hyped when it comes to companies. And what we've actually found, in fact, the reason I'm here is it's not so much a Canada-US thing, it's actually just a local geography piece, right? So if you're a company in San Francisco or Boston or New York, you get a lot of attention and a lot of capital because that's where a lot of the funds actually reside. But the truth is, if you're in Salt Lake City, Utah, or Friendswood, Texas, or Orlando, Florida, or Charlotte, North Carolina, I'm actually naming all places where we have portfolio companies, we've actually found that there's differences in the ability to attract capital, which is a difference in competitive nature, which also drives ultimately valuation. And so I think that's also true for Canada, because if you look at the number of resident funds as a function of how much capital they have under management and so forth, is probably less than the San Francisco Bay Area. So I think that that's a natural outcome of market forces, right? So and the reason I'm here, for example, is because we think that the capital flow doesn't map onto the good idea map, if you will. There's this sort of disparity or inefficiency in the marketplace between good ideas and good companies and where the capital nationally sits. Because when you look at the statistics, at least in the US, I don't know the Canadian statistics, but within healthcare, something like 3/4 of the dollars, not where the funds are, 3/4 of the dollars go to Boston, San Francisco, and New York. But 75% of all the biomedical businesses in the United States are in fact not in those three areas. And so we actually think that that is a good opportunity. In fact, when we did the whole heat map of North America, we actually felt like the inefficiency in the system actually was very high here. And so, totally fair. I'm not sure that's the best thing for entrepreneurs, actually, but I do think that there's a lot of good companies here that are relatively underfunded. So the example I use, and I'll just use my alma maters because I love them both. So I was in the San Francisco Bay Area for a long time. I went to Stanford for undergrad, and then I did all my graduate degrees at Duke, which is on the East Coast, which is in North Carolina, and not one of the big hubbub centers. But academically, those two medical centers are both pretty well-known academic medical centers. And what I found is that the first 50 professors at Stanford all had started their own companies, right? And only the first 5 professors at Duke started their companies. And so there's no way that the 50th best professor at Stanford was better than the 6th professor at Duke, but that's actually how the money flowed, because Stanford happens to be in the Bay Area and Duke is not. So we actually found that that inefficiency, unfortunately, is true in most geographies. So.
But is it, can I ask a question, or
Yeah,
is it
sure. We can go to Q&A right now.
It depends also how many people are pitching, and then actually an entrepreneur may actually move to the valley in order to be able to attract capital. I know somebody who moved from Vienna in Austria to the valley in order to fundraise for his company. And I mean, isn't it with Facebook as well? They moved basically from Boston to the valley. So the question is really what's the ratio between capital and capital seekers?
Yeah, that's right. And I would suppose, the data is again a little old, but if 40% of the venture capital is in the Bay Area, fund-wise, 40% of the capital seekers are not in the Bay Area, right? So the ratio is still off.
Okay.
Actually, you bring up a good point. A trend that we're seeing here is Canadian companies not leaving Canada, staying in Canada because of the ecosystem, because of the favorable tax credit, the grants and contributions, and being able to attract foreign direct investment. I mean, the fact that we've got such interesting panelists here tells us that this is a fertile ground for innovation, and it's about attracting the capital. And like I said, a lot of Canadian companies are sticking around, or if there is an IPO or an M&A, the founders stick around, and that's great for Canada. It's a wonderful trend that I'm seeing in the last few years.
So, I absolutely support what Garhan is saying, right? But that's from an investor's perspective. So in other words, the ability to find really good opportunities outside of the epicenters exists for us, and those good opportunities have a different value placed on that. From the entrepreneur's perspective or the company's perspective, I think the reason you still see people migrating to those centers is that if you look at the areas where traditionally there's not a lot of high-tech healthcare investment or other things, there are oftentimes huge pockets of money. So if you look at my home state, South Carolina, there are, in the Charleston region, right, and sort of that greater surrounding area, I think it's got, in the United States, the highest concentration of ex-Fortune 500 CEOs in the country, right? It's just massively wealthy. Many of those investors are interested in finding the opportunities and looking for things, but the other money is much less sophisticated. So while the money exists and it is there, it is not used to seeing the types of opportunities that can be presented and the risks and how they look at it. And so it can just be much harder to unlock that capital. I think groups like HealthQuest, ours, who can bridge that sort of knowledge gap, at least in the States, are helping the companies such as we've been talking about that are sort of stuck in these regions where they can't access the capital, or they're undercapitalized.
So first of all, thanks for your guys' insight. What's your thought on service providers who help some of these companies that are off the beaten path, so to speak, and by that I mean not in New York, Boston, San Francisco, meet with investors such as yourself or get access to capital? How do you approach those types of companies when they have service providers helping raise that capital?
Any warm introduction is, for me, better than a non-warm introduction. So, but it's also going to depend on how well I know that provider. So I've got, so if it's somebody I trained, 15 years ago, and is now, a managing partner in a firm, that's a different sort of introduction than if it's somebody I met at a conference or whatever. So they're all qualified.
So there are a lot of companies out there that link investors and companies together. They have a Rolodex, and they're everywhere. I mean, they're in New York, San Francisco. And presumably you have a relationship with these companies, so you take calls from them as they set you up with a company, knowing that this is an area you're interested in.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's where you spend your time, right? And so if we get 1,600 deals a year, that's actually not a real number, right? Well, there's just no way we're going to process 1,600 deals a year, right? So the question is, what's the filter, right? And so if you have a warm introduction and somebody actually knows your strategy and what you're likely to do, that's a good filter. And so it's a function of that intermediary's ability to know what it is that you want, right? Because they send you 10 deals, none of which you ever look at, then the 11th deal you probably won't even pay attention to. If they're calibrated to what you do, not that you'll do those first deals, but at least it's in your wheelhouse, then you're like, wow, that's a really good reference. So.
Valuation seems to be a bit of a black art especially for early stage companies. Are there certain structures that you prefer for early stage companies over when you're investing? It's, for example, convertible debt over equity stake or what it must be.
So, I'll take a first stab at it. So from my point of view, the answer is yes. And what I would say is that there is some range of valuation. I would make the supposition that for professional investors, so everybody who looks at lots of deals, I think that probably the valuation range is plus or minus 15 or 20%. The problem is when you get to capital that doesn't spend a lot of time looking at these deals, the valuation can be all over the place, especially if they're friends and family, then the valuation can really be all over the place. And so at least for us, the convertible structure is a little bit easier because what happens is you're not forcing your existing investors to price something if they're not in the market. Because what happens then if you overprice it, they're really unhappy when they ultimately meet Main Street, and so you can save yourself a lot of pain and the new and the existing investors if you can do that kind of structure. There's a limit to it, right? Because you can't have the convertible debt hang out forever, and the size of it needs to be reasonable. But if you can fit it there, that's a little bit easier when you try and raise a larger institutional round. Now, if you're investors who are doing it are quite sophisticated and they're early and they know how to price it, then great.
Yeah. If you come to Epic Capital, valuation needs to be reasonable. We see a lot of unreasonable valuation, and we can't, no matter how good the idea is, we can't really invest because, you know, we have our own investors that need to see a return. And if your valuation is too high to begin with, you will not be able to attract capital later on without perhaps going to a down round or something like that. So for us, it's also a sign of how savvy the management team is too.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that, you know, when you're a founder, what we've come across a lot is founders, they want to give away as little of the company as they can. So they really want those early valuations to be high at the beginning. And I understand why they process it that way, right? Because the sharks on the other side are trying to take a big bite out, you know, all of that, all the metaphors that you can think of. But the reality is that's probably not, or may not be your most important round of financing, right? The most important round of financing is always the one you need right now, right? You know, the one that's gonna, you get your money today and immediately you're thinking about that next round of financing. So, too high valuation, I'll just say, what we mostly see are valuations that get out of whack when there's heavy cap tables. So for one reason or another, they've, you know, got 20 physicians invested in it, or, you know, they were able to pull some of a group together like that has because they, for example, really understand the science, right? Or they think it's a really great gee whiz, they themselves will overvalue what they invested in, and that can just be very, very painful to come in after that.
For sure.
But in a case like that, where the guy is overvalued it, would you come in because you like the company and just say, okay, I can't go with that level, but I can go at this level?
Well, for us, at the end of the day, disgruntled investors can be as problematic, right? So yeah, you can always come in and you can force, if a company needs money, right? There's ways to sort of force a deal, but if it turns out that then, you know, half of the cap table's completely hacked off because they took a, you know, 50% or 75%, you know, reduction in value, they're not necessarily on that bus helping you move it forward. And then with the next round when you're trying to do, it just can be problematic. So
I mean, the other thing I'd add is it's time allocation, right? So
Yeah.
a deal comes in, right, for us, my term, for us to go break glass, we have to have conviction, right? We don't want to go and say, your price is wrong, it should be X, until we've actually done the work. But the truth is, we don't know what X is. We know that the whatever post money is not right, and so half the time we just say, I mean, we've got 1,599 other deals we can look at, and so that's the other part that you should be conscientious of, because we just won't spend the time on it.
Yeah, you're competing against hundreds of other companies when you go to VC. And it's a snowball effect. If you start off with too high a valuation, you're going to have disgruntled investors. If you can't raise the funds, you're going to be spending a lot of time trying to raise funds. It's not helpful to anyone. Charles?
That I was just going to say that the valuation is, I mean, as you look for new investors, that's always negotiable. So that, you know, J&J's always going to try to fairly value the company. Going to look for companies that are similar space, similar stage of development. You know, where were they valued, etc. So it's really ultimately hope the valuation should naturally arrive at a reasonable number. Otherwise, if it's too high, then you can't raise funds and so on. So it tends to be somewhat dynamic in terms of what that number is. But again, J&J's point of view is typically to not try to undervalue a company, but certainly will respond negatively if the company's overvalued. So it really should be a bit of a negotiation to arrive at a fair valuation.
I think we can do one more question. Yeah.
I'd like to get your comments on your own fundraising efforts and trends you see in the future when it comes to attracting money from LPs for a fund that is focused on early stage medtech versus the people focusing on immuno-oncology therapeutics. And I know it's hard to predict what the next 2 to 3 years will be, but in order for us to get funding from you guys, we need to be able to raise new funds. I'd love to know what's the climate out there.
So, for good or for bad, I actually play volleyball, but I also have knee pads for other reasons. You know, I mean, raising capital is, from a GP point of view, is not that different in the sense that, you know, we're having the same conversation, which is like, how do we get into this pension plan, and why will they take our meeting, and so forth. You know, what I've concluded, so I guess I've had the privilege of investing 7 funds now, and what I would say is that the LPs are very sophisticated financial investors, but they're usually not healthcare investors. And so the example that I would bring is, I was at a very large, well-known LP, and I was a little early, so I show up, and I'm sitting in the lobby, and there's a glass conference room, and they're presenting, somebody's presenting to these 3 investors on the other side, and I can see the deck. And it's like Brazilian forestry or something like that, private equity fund. So they're running behind, they leave, I go in there, here's healthcare, it's great. Same 3 people on the other side, by the way, they haven't moved. I'm of course late, because they're late, so I leave, and the guys behind me are like high yield debt in Morocco. So, you know, what you have to realize is that these LPs are doing asset allocation, right? And so they're not really experts in healthcare per se. So this is a little bit unfair because there are some quite sophisticated LPs, but I would say in general, they're interested in your track record, right? Your spreadsheet, what does it look like compared to the next Brazilian forestry spreadsheet and the high yield debt Morocco spreadsheet? So that's realized returns. And the other part is, you know, do they like you? Do they think you're smart? And so forth, right? Because they're not going to go in and say, well, immuno-oncology is the trend now, or something else is the trend, because by the time it gets to them, it's like 3 years too late or something like that. And so, you know, that would be my view. And then just to give you, since I happen to have all these things in my head, you know, the fundraising environment for 15 and 16 were spectacular, in part for healthcare, in part because the previous 3 markets for healthcare were outrageous. I think that that's going to change because the last 9 months have not been outrageous, and that will feed into all those venture firms' numbers probably over the next 9 months.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming.